Most of us understand the definition of faith to be trusting in a trustworthy object. And I want to take a look at that definition by way of diving into a passage found in the book of Matthew. We're going to be in chapter 14, and unlike a traditional word of encouragement where we go from the first verse all the way to the last, I wanted to take it kind of in the reverse order. And what I mean by that is I want to look at the last section of Matthew and then work our way forward. And in doing so, I think what the gospel writer gives to us are three implications or applications of how our faith defines us. I think that we need to always be putting Jesus first in our faith. But the way that that will expose itself is in three different areas, starting with this last section of the book of Matthew in chapter 14, verses 22 to 36. And in that particular section, the gospel writer tells us that our faith will find our fears. Our faith will find our fears. I'm not going to read all 16 verses or 14 verses, but I want to highlight and bring your attention to this very familiar story of Jesus walking on water. And when we get to the passage where Jesus wants other people to walk on water, he says this in verse 27. He says, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And then in verse 28, we know that Peter answered and said, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' And Jesus in verse 29 said what? 'Come.' And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus." And this is where I believe that the gospel writer is telling us that our fear will be exposed because we're afraid to do something. And the question is when we find that moment of being afraid to do something, which will we choose, faith or fear? We know that Peter stepped out and he began to walk toward Jesus. But then look at verse 30. "But seeing the wind," what? "He became afraid and began to sink and cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to Peter, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?'" You know, one of the most exhilarating and yet fearful moments in my life, and maybe you've experienced this as well, is going skydiving. It was my son's 18th birthday. And for his present, he wanted to go down to Casa Grande and go skydiving. And with fear and trepidation, I went with him. I have to tell you that it was a great step of faith to trust in a trustworthy object, which was this airplane, and then to leave that trustworthy object falling from 13,000 feet. Was I fearful? Absolutely. And so I just want to expose this idea that when we have an opportunity to trust in Jesus by putting Jesus first, fear will definitely creep in. And I'm going to encourage you to live by faith. The second point that I think the gospel writer makes is that faith will train your brain. Look at verses 13 to 21 in Matthew chapter 14. Again, a very familiar setting that most of us are aware of, and that is Jesus feeding the 5,000. And without reading all of those verses, let me just highlight back in verse 15. "When it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'The place is desolate, and the time is already past, so send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said to them in verse 16, 'They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish.'" You see, I think when we take our cue, when Jesus tells us, "Hey, you feed them," what he's saying is that you need to retrain your brain to look at something that doesn't look plausible, but by faith believe it can happen. He trusted that the disciples would do this, and what they offered back to him was their logic. We only have so much food, and it can't feed these people. Jesus said then in verse 18, "Let me show you how to do that. Bring them here to me." And of course, we know the rest of that story. I wonder When we have these opportunities, will we look at what's in front of us or trust Jesus? It was last fall that I had an opportunity that I would have never expected, and that was to interview the 43rd President of the United States, President George Bush. I was given 3 weeks' notice, and again, fear crept in, but more than that, logic crept in. What do I have to offer a President of the United States by way of 45 minutes worth of interview questions? Needless to say, the event came and went, and I was incredibly thankful to be a part of that. But looking back, I certainly wished I had more faith that God was providing this opportunity and that I could enjoy the process rather than live with doubt and fear. Finally, though, the author in the Gospel of Matthew says this. I believe he says that our faith will yield to Yahweh. And what I mean by that is if you look at the very first 12 verses of Matthew 14, what you're going to find isn't to be expected. And what I mean by that is we see Jesus feeding the 5,000. We see Jesus walking on water, and he tells us by faith to believe that we can do the same. And so the logic would be, well, by faith then, I can do anything. And yet in verses 1 through 12, we find the death of John the Baptist. And without again reading all of these passages, you may know the story. And John was in prison from Herod, and Herod's wife's daughter danced for him, and he asked for what she wanted for her birthday present. And she said, because of her mother's request, John's head on a platter. And long story short, that's exactly what happened. The executioner came down to the prison, and I believe, honestly, with a little bit of sobriety there, cut off John's head. No amount of faith was going to save John. It was God's sovereign will that happened. And so while faith is such a powerful element in the believer's life, I never, ever want to forget that my faith needs to yield to the will of God. It was God's will in his sovereign plan that John lose his life on that day. You know, it was 10 years ago, actually this year, 10 years ago, where I lost my wife to a car accident. And I'll never, ever get over that. But I have learned to agree that it was her time to leave this earth and spend the rest of eternity with God in heaven. Sometimes I think our faith gets ahead of us by way of we believe that we can do anything, anywhere with anyone. And while that's a great, powerful way to live life, don't ever forget that God's will comes before ours. So I hope these words out of Matthew encourage you. Have a great day. Live for the Lord.